You hurl the stone without thinking. The sun above Qumran beats down like molten brass, blinding, relentless. The rock arcs through dry air and vanishes into the black mouth of the cave. A heartbeat later, the silence breaks. A hollow crack echoes back at you, not the thud of rock against earth. Something fragile has shattered. You freeze. The desert wind scratches your skin like sandpaper. The goat you were chasing bleats somewhere among the rocks, indifferent to what you've done. You take a cautious step closer. Heat shimmers off the limestone walls, distorting everything like a mirage. The smell of dust and sun-baked clay fills your nose. The sound was unmistakable. Clay breaking. Something man-made. You edge forward, your bare feet scraping pebbles. Inside the cave, the air cools, dry and still, as if the world has been holding its breath for centuries. Light from the entrance fades to a dull amber glow that paints your hands and arms in the color of old parchment. You crouch beside the broken jar. Its fragments are pale and thin, lighter than bone. Within the shards lies a bundle wrapped in rotting linen. You touch it, and it disintegrates slightly beneath your fingers, sending a faint smell of age and salt into the air. The parchment beneath glows faintly in the dim light, streaked with black ink that has refused to fade. You unroll the edge carefully. Strange letters swim before your eyes. Ancient, deliberate, beautiful, Hebrew. But not like any you've seen scratched onto walls or etched on charms at the market. These are deliberate words written by a steady hand, as if meant to last forever. A cold current runs through you. This is no forgotten pottery. Someone hid these here, protected them. You glance deeper into the cave and realize there are more jars, dozens. Some sealed, some broken. The floor is littered with time itself. Outside, the sun burns without mercy. But within this cave, the world feels suspended between two eternities. You cannot name the feeling that takes hold of you. It is awe. It is fear. It is the awareness that you have trespassed into a silence older than kingdoms. You don't yet know it, but the words before you will rewrite the story of God and man. A gust of wind rushes in from the desert, scattering sand into the cave. The parchment trembles in your hands like something alive. And for the first time in 2,000 years, the desert whispers back. Long before that shepherd ever wandered into the cliffs of Qumran, another people had walked the same paths, leaving footprints that the desert refused to erase. They called themselves the Sons of Light, though history would later name them the Essenes. In the blistering heart of Judea, near the silent blue of the Dead Sea, they built a settlement of stone where isolation was devotion and silence was strength. Every dawn, the men rose before the Sunday. They washed in ritual baths carved from the limestone and wrapped themselves in coarse white linen. Their lives were a rhythm of labor and prayer, of ink and obedience. They wrote by the narrow light of oil lamps, copying sacred texts with the precision of surgeons. Each stroke of the reed pen was both act of worship and act of defiance. Beyond their walls, Rome ruled with iron and fear. Inside, the Essenes wrote about purity, prophecy, and the coming of a final battle between good and evil. The desert shaped them. Food was simple, often sparse. Water, rationed with care. The wind howled endlessly across the salt plains, carrying dust from the ruins of empires. Yet they believed themselves chosen, a remnant preserving truth while the rest of the world drowned in corruption. They lived without gold, without women, without power, convinced that the end of days was near and that only the righteous would survive it. In the heat of the midday sun, the air over their scriptorium shimmered. Inside, silence ruled, except for the faint scratching of pen on parchment. One man would read aloud from the sacred text while others copied, line after line, preserving what he spoke. Ink mixed with soot and oil, absorbed by skins of goats, carefully treated to endure time itself. They wrote the words of Isaiah, of the Psalms, of Moses, and of unknown prophets whose names were already fading into the dust. Their leader, a man known only as the teacher of righteousness, spoke of a day when light would triumph and the unfaithful would fall. To the Romans, they were ghosts. To the priests in Jerusalem, they were heretics. To themselves, they were the last guardians of divine truth. When they sealed their scrolls in jars and hid them within the caves, they did not mean to vanish. They meant to endure. The wind that covered their footprints did not erase them. It preserved them. The settlement would fall. The people would disappear. But the ink, that stubborn, sacred ink, would outlive them all. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, a storm gathered over the Dead Sea, and in that gathering wind, history began to whisper again. When the first jars were opened, the world had no idea what it was staring at. The fragments seemed ordinary at a glance, browned and brittle with age. But under the dim light of a scholar's lamp, the letters gleamed with unsettling clarity. Ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek intertwined like forgotten languages arguing across centuries. It was as if someone had bottled a library and buried it beneath stone. The parchments carried names that echoed through the ages: Genesis, Exodus, Psalms, Isaiah. Yet these were older than any version known to exist. Some fragments belonged to texts that had never been seen before. Others held alternate lines to sacred verses, whispers of an earlier scripture that predated the polished words that would later form the Bible. The great Isaiah scroll, nearly complete, stretched more than 20 feet in length. When unrolled for the first time, the ink looked as though it had been written yesterday. Among the jars lay the community rule, the moral code of the Essenes. It spoke of humility, ritual cleansing, and an unwavering devotion to light. Every action, from eating to speaking, was bound by purity. Beside it rested the war scroll, a chilling prophecy of an apocalyptic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. It read not like allegory but as military instruction, naming weapons, strategies, and hymns to be sung before battle. The air around those manuscripts seemed to thrum with quiet conviction. Each parchment carried a different rhythm of belief, yet together they formed a portrait of a people caught between revelation and survival. Some scrolls spoke of angels descending to guide the faithful. Others hinted at a mysterious teacher betrayed by his followers. Scholars would later debate whether these writings bridged the spiritual gap between ancient Judaism and the earliest stirrings of Christianity. As more fragments emerged, each was catalogued, photographed, and carefully placed behind glass. Yet even in their stillness, they pulsed with questions. Who had written them? Why were they hidden? And why, after 2,000 years of silence, did they resurface now? The ink was iron gall mixed with soot and faith. The parchment, scraped from animal skin, still carried faint traces of scent, like dry salt and desert wind. When handled, the scrolls whispered, a faint crackle that sounded almost like breath. Outside the laboratory, Jerusalem thrummed with life, but inside, time had folded onto itself. Scholars bent over fragments that had once been copied by trembling hands in flickering torchlight. Every curve of a letter, every missing corner of parchment, every faint trace of human fingerprint told the same unspoken truth. These were not mere relics, they were voices. And now, at last, the world was listening. The world the Essenes knew collapsed beneath the weight of empire. By the middle of the 1st century, the Roman legions had carved their way across Judea, their banners red with conquest. Rebellion flared like dry grass in summer, and Jerusalem burned beneath the eagle's shadow. From the cliffs of Qumran, the Essenes could see the distant plumes of smoke rising from the holy city. The air trembled with the sound of war. They had always believed this moment would come. The scrolls spoke of it, the end of days when the sons of darkness would march against the light. Yet belief offered little comfort when the thunder of hooves drew closer. The Dead Sea shimmered like molten glass beneath a crimson sky as the sect prepared for what they knew was inevitable. The men gathered in their stone halls, silent but resolute. The teacher of righteousness had long warned that faith alone would not preserve the truth. It had to be hidden, buried beyond the reach of those who sought power over it. They wrapped the scrolls in linen, sealed them in clay jars, and carried them under the moonlight toward the caves that watched over the settlement like open eyes. Each jar was laid into darkness with care. They were placed upright, cushioned by sand, sealed with bitumen to keep out time itself. The cave mouths swallowed their torches one by one, until only the stars bore witness. Perhaps they prayed before they left. Perhaps they whispered the verses they had spent their lives preserving. No one would ever know. When the Romans finally came, they found little more than rubble. The scriptorium was ash, the baths filled with dust. The Essenes vanished into the desert or perished, defending what could not be seen. Rome wrote their story in silence. The scrolls were forgotten, the settlement reclaimed by wind and salt. Centuries passed. The caves became homes for owls and serpents. Sand buried the paths where prayers once echoed. The ink that had spoken of divine promise faded into darkness, waiting. Only the desert remembered. The storm that followed scattered the last traces of the community. Their words lay beneath rock and dust, untouched by empire, untouched by time. And though their bodies turned to earth, their faith did not die. It slept. Somewhere between ruin and revelation, those sealed jars waited for the world to stumble upon them again. And when it did, the silence they left behind would roar louder than any army that destroyed them. The shepherd never meant to rewrite history. He had been chasing a stray goat across the cliffs above the Dead Sea, its bleating echoing through the sun-cracked stone. When his stone struck that hidden jar, he thought he had broken some worthless vessel left by travelers long gone. Days later, curiosity brought him back with a friend. They crawled into the same cave, eyes adjusting to the cool half-dark, and pulled out the ancient jars one by one. Inside lay the parchment rolls, wrapped in linen and hardened by age. Some were intact, others reduced to fragments that flaked at the slightest touch. The men could not read the writing, yet they sensed its weight. The air inside the cave felt heavy, thick with something sacred. They carried a few scrolls back to their camp, unaware they were holding the oldest surviving words of the Bible. By the time word reached Bethlehem and Jerusalem, rumors had already begun to twist. Some said the scrolls contained a treasure map. Others whispered they were cursed. The shepherd sold a few to an antiquities dealer, who kept them hidden in his shop behind shelves of pottery and coins. There they sat, gathering more dust, until a Syrian archbishop named Athanasius Samuel heard of the discovery. In 1948, as war fractured the land, Samuel bought several of the scrolls and carried them to Jerusalem. He examined the ink and parchment by candlelight, marveling at the precision of the letters. Later that year, he transported them to the United States, hoping to find a buyer who would preserve them properly. When no one came forward, he placed an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC for sale. The headline caught the attention of an Israeli archaeologist named Yigael Yadin, son of the renowned scholar Eleazar Sukenik, who had already acquired other scrolls from the same caves. Within months, the scattered fragments were reunited under careful protection, and the world's greatest puzzle began. Scholars gathered from across continents. The scrolls were examined under magnifying lenses, ultraviolet lamps, and even microscopes. Every tear, every hole, every ink mark was catalogued. The discovery ignited a firestorm of excitement and controversy. If these scrolls were genuine, they predated any known copy of the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years. The shepherd could not have known what he had done. His casual throw had cracked open a silence that had lasted 2 millennia. In that single echo, faith, archaeology, and human curiosity collided. Far from the cave, in glass laboratories and candlelit monasteries, the same question hung in the air. Who had written these words? And why had they chosen the desert to keep them safe? The scrolls that had slept for 2,000 years awoke into a world divided by politics, faith, and power. What began as a discovery of faith quickly became a contest of possession. When the first scholars confirmed the authenticity of the manuscripts, both Israel and Jordan claimed them as part of their heritage. The caves of Qumran lay on land that shifted hands after war, and so the ancient words became hostages of modern borders. In the early years after the discovery, the scrolls were guarded inside the Palestine Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem, then under Jordanian rule. Access was granted to only a handful of Western scholars chosen by ecclesiastical and political authorities. They worked in secrecy, each permitted to study only a small portion. The rest remained locked away, their contents known to no one. To outsiders, it was as if the desert had spoken only to a chosen few. Rumors grew like dust storms. Some claimed the hidden fragments contained forbidden books of the Bible. Others whispered of a text that spoke directly of Christ, concealed by those who feared its consequences. The truth was more ordinary and yet far greater. The secrecy came not from conspiracy, but from the slow, meticulous nature of restoration. Each piece of parchment was fragile as ash. To touch it without training was to destroy it. Still, the lack of transparency bred suspicion. After the Six-Day War in the late 1960s, Israel gained control of East Jerusalem, and with it, the scrolls. The government transferred them to the Israel Museum, where they were kept under armed guard and stored in a vault known as the Shrine of the Book. Yet even then, access remained limited. Generations of scholars passed, waiting for permission to glimpse the texts. It would take decades before the veil lifted. In the late 20th century, photographs of the scrolls began to circulate beyond the academic walls. Then came the digital age, when high-resolution imaging allowed anyone with curiosity and a screen to study what once belonged only to priests and archaeologists. The monopoly of knowledge shattered, and the desert's whisper became a global chorus. Ownership, in the end, proved meaningless. The scrolls belonged to no single nation. They were fragments of a world that existed before such boundaries. Words written in solitude by a people long vanished had become the shared inheritance of humanity. And yet, in every archive, under every layer of dust, lingered the same haunting thought. If this was what one cave revealed, what secrets still slept in the others? Not all the scrolls were made of parchment. In one of the final caves explored near Qumran, archaeologists uncovered something that glinted strangely under their lanterns. It was not soft or fragile, but cold and metallic. A single sheet of hammered copper, rolled tight like a scroll, sealed with corrosion. When they tried to unroll it, the metal cracked. It had to be carefully cut into segments at the University of Manchester so that the words, pressed into its surface, could finally be read. What they discovered was unlike anything else from the caves. It was not prophecy or law or poetry. It was a list. 64 entries, each describing the location of vast stores of gold, silver, and sacred vessels. The text read like a treasure map, written by a priestly hand. In the ruin that is in the valley of Achor, under the steps leading to the east, 40 talents of silver. The weight of the riches described would amount to tons of precious metal, an unimaginable fortune. Scholars debated its purpose endlessly. Was it an inventory of temple treasure hidden before Jerusalem's destruction? A symbolic record of spiritual wealth? Or an elaborate decoy meant to mislead enemies of the faith? The copper scroll refused to yield an answer. Expeditions set out to search for the treasure. Guided by its cryptic instructions, they dug near Jericho, combed the Judean hills, even tunneled beneath ancient monasteries. Nothing was ever found. Some believed the hoard had long since been discovered by others. Others suspected it had never existed at all, that the true treasure was not gold but faith, the enduring conviction that divine promise outlasts conquest. Unlike the parchment scrolls, the copper scroll bore no signature of the Essene's style of humility or obedience. Its tone was urgent, practical, almost defiant. It hinted at a people desperate to preserve something tangible as their world collapsed. Perhaps it was written during the chaos of the Roman siege, when priests hid sacred vessels to keep them from foreign hands. Or perhaps it was composed by those who understood that faith itself could be hidden, waiting for rediscovery like light beneath stone. The corroded metal still bears the marks of the chisels that carved it. Each line is an act of human will against time. In the grooves of the copper, faith became endurance. No gold was ever unearthed, yet the scroll achieved something far greater. It forced the modern world to confront a truth the Essenes already knew. Treasure is never measured in coins or crowns. It is measured in what survives when everything else burns. Time had darkened the parchment, curled its edges, and dimmed its ink, but the modern age would find new ways to make the past speak again. In sterile laboratories, behind glass walls and white light, the scrolls were reborn. Scholars who once bent over them with magnifying lenses now wielded digital microscopes and infrared scanners. What had been invisible to the naked eye for centuries began to glow beneath beams of light finer than dust. Each fragment was laid flat on glass, its edges secured by tiny weights. Cameras rotated above with mechanical precision, capturing layers of color and wavelength. Under ultraviolet exposure, letters once lost to decay shimmered faintly like constellations on aged skin. What had seemed blank revealed faint strokes of Hebrew script. Some fragments contained words from psalms never before seen in that form. Others revealed corrections, marginal notes, or tiny guide marks that showed how the scribes had aligned their columns. The process was meticulous, almost reverent. Scientists wore gloves and breathed through masks, their movements slow and deliberate, aware that a slip could erase the very history they sought to preserve. Each scroll fragment was scanned hundreds of times, producing digital replicas that could survive even if the originals one day turned to dust. The desert's silence had become a chorus of pixel and light. At the Israel Antiquities Authority, a special imaging project brought together physicists, computer engineers, and linguists. They called it the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library. Piece by piece, the scattered words were reunited in a virtual space, forming a complete digital archive open to anyone in the world. It was the opposite of the secrecy that once surrounded them. The Essenes had hidden their words from corruption. Now technology revealed them to every curious soul with a screen. More surprises emerged. Under thermal imaging, researchers found ink composition varying slightly between caves, suggesting multiple scribes, or even separate communities preserving parallel traditions. DNA testing of the parchment itself identified the animals it came from, tracing trade and contact routes across ancient Judea. What had once been mystery became data, yet the awe remained. In these quiet rooms of humming machines, the work felt almost sacred. The past no longer belonged only to scholars and priests. It belonged to everyone who looked and listened. The same ink that had survived empire and exile now pulsed through digital light, proving once again that faith and knowledge were never enemies. They were partners across centuries, both seeking the same thing, to preserve what matters. The rediscovery of the scrolls did more than illuminate history. It reshaped it. For centuries, scholars had relied on medieval copies of the Hebrew Bible, confident in their accuracy, yet uncertain how closely they matched the words that ancient believers once read aloud. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were compared to the later versions, the result stunned the world. The words, separated by more than 1,000 years, were nearly identical. The revelation silenced centuries of doubt. It proved that the scribes who had preserved the Old Testament had done so with a discipline bordering on sacred obsession. But it also revealed small, haunting differences, subtle shifts in phrasing, alternate endings, even passages that never appeared again. These variations became mirrors reflecting how human hands shaped divine words across generations. Beyond theology, the scrolls bridged worlds once thought separate. The hymns and prophecies mirrored ideas that would later echo in early Christianity: purity of heart, the coming of a Messiah, the battle between light and darkness. Some scholars argued that the Essenes' writings represented a kind of spiritual bridge between Judaism and the teachings that would soon emerge from Galilee. Others warned against easy connections, reminding that history is rarely clean. Yet even caution could not erase the strange familiarity that flowed through the texts. To believers, the scrolls were confirmation of faith's endurance. To historians, they were a map of how faith evolves under pressure. And to writers, poets, and seekers, they were proof that words outlive the hands that write them. Each letter on those parchments had been traced by a man who likely died, never knowing that his labor would survive empires. The ink carried more than religion. It carried the pulse of human continuity. The scrolls also spoke to the loneliness of belief. The Essenes had fled a corrupt world to preserve what they thought was pure. In doing so, they had locked themselves away from the very people who might have understood them. Centuries later, when their words resurfaced, they finally reached the audience they never lived to meet. The desert that had buried them became their greatest ally. It turned dryness into preservation, silence into protection, oblivion into memory. Against all logic, the most fragile materials ever made, animal skin and ink, outlasted marble, empire, and monument. The words of Isaiah still sang across the centuries. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. The scrolls proved that verse true in the most literal way possible. What was meant to vanish became immortal. What was whispered in solitude became the shared inheritance of every voice that followed. In the heart of Jerusalem, where the hum of modern life never stops, a white dome rises above a pool of still water. Its shape is deliberate, a lid echoing the clay jars that once slept in the caves of Qumran. This is the shrine of the book, built to house the Dead Sea Scrolls, a sanctuary not of faith alone, but of memory. Here, beneath controlled light and silence, the oldest words ever written about creation and covenant rest behind glass. Visitors enter through a dark tunnel. The walls curve, the light fades, and the temperature cools to protect what time nearly devoured. At the center stands a replica of the great Isaiah scroll, the most complete of all. Its parchment glows faintly under soft illumination, the ink dark and deliberate, its letters forming an unbroken ribbon of devotion that stretches across millennia. People approach quietly, some with curiosity, others with reverence, yet all leave with the same feeling, the awareness of time's fragile mercy. Around the dome, the architecture mirrors a deeper truth. Opposite the white roof stands a black basalt wall, representing the eternal struggle between light and darkness, the same duality that filled the Essenes' writings 2,000 years ago. The reflection of the dome shimmers in the pool below, suggesting the endless dialogue between earth and heaven, the mortal and the divine. Inside the archives, scientists work in near silence. Humidity is measured by the minute. Light exposure is timed. Every detail is calibrated to ensure that the scrolls will never fade again. The fragments, each a survivor of fire and sand, lie within glass casings where human breath cannot touch them. Yet even through that barrier, they seem alive, humming with the faint resonance of voices that once believed the world was ending. It is strange, standing there amid the hum of air filters and the murmured footsteps of visitors, to realize that the words of men who fled Rome's armies now live in the capital of a modern state. The parchment they hid from fire now lies under electric light. What they buried in fear, the world now guards with pride. The desert gave up its secret, and in return, humanity built it a monument. The scrolls no longer belong to one faith or nation. They belong to everyone who has ever wondered what survives when the rest of history burns away. Outside, Jerusalem's traffic moves on. The sun sets over the city of prophets and kings, and the dome glows softly against the twilight. Beneath it, the words sleep again, not forgotten this time, but finally at peace. 2,000 years ago, a hand dipped a reed into ink and began to write beneath a desert sky. The man who wrote did not know his name would be forgotten, that the world he served would vanish, that his script would one day lie in silence beneath sand and stone. Yet he wrote anyway, each stroke a quiet defiance of death. When the shepherd's stone shattered that ancient jar, time folded in on itself. The ink that once told of angels, kings, and salvation breathed again. Those words had slept through empires, through crusades, through wars that remade borders but never erased belief. What began as devotion became survival. What was meant for a small brotherhood became a gift to an entire species still trying to understand itself. In the hush of the shrine of the book, the air hums faintly with electricity and reverence. Every fragment of parchment is both artifact and heartbeat, the last echo of voices that refuse to be silenced. The scrolls remind us that civilization is built not on monuments or conquests, but on words fragile, imperfect, enduring words. They also remind us that every age hides its truths. Somewhere, perhaps still buried beneath rock and salt, lie other messages from the past waiting for another chance to be heard. The desert has not finished speaking. When you leave the museum and step into the light of Jerusalem, the city's noise returns. Engines, footsteps, the murmur of prayer rising from distant temples. Yet, something lingers. The memory of those letters, so small yet so infinite, clings to your thoughts like dust on skin. You realize that what survived was never just scripture. It was the stubborn hope of human hands refusing to let meaning die. The desert wind still carries that same promise. It whispers across the ancient cliffs of Qumran, through caves where silence once guarded faith, through the city that still believes in miracles. Ink fades, empires fall. But the words will always find their way back to the light.